Tuesday, December 12th, 1944, Camp Ruston, Louisiana, United States. Obergefreiter Hans Bergmann gripped the thin olive-drab blanket between his calloused fingers and laughed, a bitter scoffing sound that drew nods from the men crowding the wooden barracks around him. The fabric felt impossibly light, almost translucent when held to the bare bulb overhead, paper-thin, worthless. "American qualitate," he muttered, the word dripping with contempt learned from 4 years of Wehrmacht propaganda. The blanket couldn't weigh more than a kilogram, perhaps less. He'd wrapped himself in heavier tablecloths back in Dusseldorf. Around him, 20 other newly arrived prisoners examined their identical issue with similar disdain, turning the material over in hands that still bore the grime of the Atlantic crossing, the chaos of North African defeat, the long humiliation of surrender. The December wind rattled the barracks walls, slipping through gaps in the pine boards. Bergmann felt the cold kiss his neck, his shoulders. He thought of his Reichswehr wool blanket, thick, heavy, properly German, lost somewhere in the smoking ruins of Kasserine Pass 6 months earlier. That blanket had weight, substance, the heft of real protection. This American thing felt like a costume prop, theatrical deception. "They mock us even with their charity," said Unteroffizier Otto Kraus from the adjacent bunk, holding his blanket at arm's length as though it might contaminate him. "Look at this. Ein Witz. A joke." What none of them understood, what Bergmann couldn't possibly foresee as he tossed the offensive fabric onto his straw mattress that first frozen Louisiana night, was that this thin scrap of American textile engineering would soon reveal a truth more devastating than any battlefield defeat, not just about blankets, but about everything. About the nation they'd served, the enemy they'd been taught to despise, and the catastrophic gap between propaganda and reality that would shatter their understanding of the world itself. Hans Bergmann, 26 years old, had been a promising mechanic in Dusseldorf before the Wehrmacht conscripted him in 1940. He'd served with the 21st Panzer Division, survived the brutal heat of North Africa, watched Rommel's vaunted Africa Corps disintegrate under relentless Allied pressure. When British troops captured him outside Tunis in May 1943, he'd been wearing the same uniform for 3 weeks, eating sawdust bread, drinking oil-fouled water from shell craters. The journey to America, crowded transport ship, processing center in Virginia. Finally, this piney Louisiana camp had taken 7 months. Throughout his service, the message had been consistent, hammered home by officers, by newspapers, by the weekly newsreels. America was a mongrel nation of weaklings and cowards. Jews and Negroes controlled their industries, producing inferior equipment. Their soldiers couldn't fight. Their economy was built on speculation and Jewish finance, a house of cards that Luftwaffe bombs would soon collapse. The Führer himself had declared Americans soft, decadent, incapable of sacrifice. Remember, their battalion commander had told them before Kasserine, the Americans have no fighting spirit. They care only for comfort, for their jazz music and their Hollywood films. 1 good German soldier equals 10 Americans. We will sweep them into the sea. Bergmann had believed it. Why wouldn't he? Every newspaper in Germany confirmed it. Every radio broadcast reinforced it. When you saw American films, the few permitted before the war, they seemed to prove it. Overfed people obsessed with trivialities, romance, entertainment, not the hardened Volk of the Reich, tempered by discipline and sacrifice. The reality of his final months in German service had been different. Hunger that gnawed constantly, boots that fell apart, vehicles without fuel, without ammunition, without spare parts. The steady, terrifying realization that Rommel's supplies came in trickles while British and American equipment arrived in floods. But propaganda explained this too. Germany was fighting the entire world, encircled by jealous enemies. Shortages were temporary. Secret weapons would turn the tide. Final victory remained certain. Now, in American captivity, Bergmann expected brutality disguised as mercy. Perhaps they'd be worked to death. Perhaps starved slowly. Perhaps the thin blankets were intended to freeze them systematically. Deniable murder through deliberate neglect. Americans were treacherous. Everyone knew this. Their kindness would be calculated cruelty. The statistics he didn't know would have staggered him. German wool blanket production, 1943, 2.1 million units for entire Wehrmacht American blanket production, 1943, 35 million units, enough for every soldier, every sailor, every prisoner, with millions more stockpiled German textile ration per soldier, 1944, 4.3 kilograms annually. American textile ration per soldier, 1944, 23 kilograms annually, more than 5 times greater average warmth retention of German wool blanket, 6.8 CLO units at 900 grams, average warmth retention of American blanket, new design, 7.2 CLO units at 680 grams, lighter yet warmer through advanced synthetic wool blend. That first night, Bergmann wrapped himself in the thin American blanket with grim resignation. The Louisiana temperature had dropped to 2 degrees Celsius, cold for the region, though nothing compared to Russian winters he'd heard about from Eastern Front survivors. He lay rigid on the thin mattress, waiting for the cold to seep through, waiting to prove his contempt justified. An hour passed. 2. His body heat should have dissipated through the pathetic fabric. His teeth should be chattering. Instead, warmth accumulated, trapped between the blanket's seemingly inadequate fibers and his skin. Not perfect warmth. The barracks had no heat, but adequate warmth, comfortable warmth, the kind of warmth his heavy Reichswehr blanket had provided only when doubled over. Impossible. He shifted testing, convinced his assessment was wrong. But no. The blanket held heat with remarkable efficiency. The weave that looked so thin apparently contained thousands of tiny air pockets, insulating without weight. He could move freely, unlike the restrictive heaviness of German wool. When he turned onto his side, the blanket moved with him rather than pulling away. Around the darkened barracks, he heard no complaints, no chattering teeth, no muttered curses at American cheapness, just steady breathing and occasional snores. 26 German soldiers, expecting to freeze, sleeping soundly. Bergmann stared at the ceiling boards. Ein Trick, a trick. They'd been given special blankets this first night, perhaps. Or the barracks was secretly heated. Or Louisiana wasn't actually cold. Some explanation existed that preserved the fundamental truth. German engineering was superior, American products inferior. He forced his eyes shut. The warmth remained undeniable and confusing. The evidence began accumulating 3 days later, December 15, 1944. The morning inspection revealed that new prisoners had arrived overnight, another transport from North Africa, men captured at the same battles as Bergmann's group. As they shuffled toward the supply building for processing, Bergmann noticed their condition: skeletal thin, uniforms in tatters, several limping from untreated wounds. They looked like scarecrows, animated by desperation. The camp commandant, a middle-aged American major with a slight paunch and bored expression, directed them through the same routine Bergmann had experienced. Each man received 2 uniforms, 2 sets of underwear, 4 pairs of socks, boots, toiletries, and 2 blankets, the same thin American issue. But what captured Bergmann's attention was the pile of rejected blankets in the corner of the supply building. Dozens of them, maybe 100, stacked carelessly like discarded newspapers. An American corporal, a Negro Bergmann noted with the reflexive surprise of propaganda-trained prejudice, was sorting through them, pulling some aside, tossing others into a large bin marked salvage. "What happens to those?" Bergmann asked in halting English, pointing at the salvage bin. The corporal glanced up, surprised to be addressed. "These? Worn out. Going to reclaim the fibers, make new blankets, or ship 'em to textile mills." He held up one of the discarded blankets, showing a small tear near the hem. "See, can't give damaged goods to you boys. Regulations." Damaged. The blanket looked nearly perfect, a tear perhaps 5 centimeters long, easily mendable. In Germany, such a blanket would serve another 5 years. Here, Americans threw it away for recycling. The casual waste made Bergmann's stomach clench. "How many blankets do you have?" he heard himself ask. The corporal shrugged. "In this camp, maybe 10,000 in the warehouse. We get new shipments monthly whether we need 'em or not. Army surplus, you know how it is." He grinned. "Y'all Krauts picked the right country to surrender to. My cousin's guarding Germans up in Michigan says they're complaining about having too many blankets in summer. 10,000 blankets for a camp housing 4,200 prisoners and 800 American personnel. A ratio of 2 blankets per person with thousands extra. Meanwhile, Germany was telling its soldiers that textile shortages were temporary, that everyone must sacrifice for victory. Bergmann walked away, thoughts churning. That afternoon, during the work detail assigning prisoners to camp maintenance jobs, he was grouped with a dozen men, including Otto Kraus, the Unteroffizier who'd mocked the blankets that first night. Their task, winterizing the barracks by plugging gaps in the walls with strips of blankets. "They're using them for insulation," Kraus muttered in German, careful to keep his voice low around the American guards. Blankets, as construction material. The guards demonstrated casually, stuffing the fabric into cracks, securing it with tacks. Bergmann calculated rapidly. Each barracks received perhaps 15 blankets worth of insulation. 43 barracks in the compound. That meant more than 600 blankets, premium textiles, deployed as glorified rags. One guard, a farm boy from Iowa named Patterson, noticed their expressions. "Don't worry," he said in mangled German learned from other prisoners. "Plenty more where those came from. We got blankets coming out our ears. Last month, headquarters sent us 2,000 new ones, even though we said we were fully stocked. Government contracts, you know. Gotta spend the budget or lose it next year. Gotta spend the budget." Bergmann's mind reeled. Germany was fighting a war of survival, scrounging every scrap of wool from occupied territories, reducing rations to starvation levels to free up resources for the military. America was complaining about having too many supplies, using war material for insulation, throwing away perfectly serviceable equipment because of minor damage. That evening, lying under his thin American blanket that somehow kept him warmer than any German wool had managed, Bergmann thought about production capacity, about the industrial gap he'd refused to acknowledge. The blanket wasn't just fabric, it was a message written in synthetic fibers. This is what we can afford to give our enemies. Imagine what we give our soldiers. December 18th, 1944. The prisoners began settling into camp routine. Work details, meals, free time in the recreation yard. The American guards treated them with matter-of-fact efficiency. Not cruel, but not particularly friendly either. Correct. Professional. This puzzled many Germans who'd expected either sadistic abuse or calculated psychological torture. Bergmann was assigned to the camp maintenance shop, where his mechanical background proved valuable. The shop contained tools he'd only seen in specialized German facilities. Electric drills, pneumatic wrenches, precision measuring instruments, a full set of American-made wrenches that fitted together with microscopic precision. The tool quality stunned him. Each wrench machined to tolerances he'd rarely encountered outside aircraft manufacturing plants. The American sergeant running the shop, a career mechanic named Kowalski from Pennsylvania, treated the equipment with casual indifference bordering on disrespect. When Bergmann instinctively wiped down a precision level before storing it, Kowalski laughed. "Don't worry about it, Hans. If it breaks, requisition a new one. Takes about 2 weeks." He gestured at a catalog on the workbench, thick as a Berlin phone book, labeled Supply Manual Maintenance Equipment. "Got everything in there. Just fill out the form." 2 weeks to replace precision equipment. In Germany, such tools were carefully inventoried, passed down through generations of craftsmen, hoarded like precious metals. Bergmann had once waited 3 months for a replacement micrometer, only to receive one reconditioned from a tool manufactured in 1928. But the real revelation came when Kowalski opened the supply room to retrieve materials for a repair job. Floor-to-ceiling shelves stocked with boxes of screws, organized by size and type, spools of wire, copper, steel, aluminum, cans of lubricants, a dozen varieties, solvents, paints, welding rods, grinding wheels, drill bits, saw blades. Everything labeled, everything abundant, everything cataloged with bureaucratic American thoroughness. "Need anything, just grab it," Kowalski said. "Keep a list so I know what to reorder, but don't be shy. Uncle Sam's got deep pockets." Deep pockets. The phrase seemed obscene in its casualness. Bergmann thought of German mechanics he'd known, carefully hoarding every screw, every bolt, reusing damaged fasteners until they literally crumbled, saving wire insulation to melt down and reuse. Making do, always making do, because supplies came rarely and in insufficient quantities. Over the following weeks, patterns emerged that transformed Bergmann's understanding not just of American wealth, but of German poverty. The laundry incident. December 22nd, prisoners received fresh uniforms twice weekly. The camp laundry processed thousands of items daily using industrial washing machines, 5 massive units that cleaned, dried, and pressed with mechanical efficiency. When one machine broke down, Bergmann helped repair it. While working, he noticed the supply room contained 4 backup motors, 3 replacement drums, boxes of spare belts, and gaskets. "We replace the machines every 3 years, whether they're broken or not," Kowalski explained. "Newer models are more efficient. Old ones get sold as surplus or scrapped." 3 years. In Germany, machinery from the 1920s still struggled along, patched and repatched, because new equipment didn't exist. The idea of replacing functional machines because newer versions offered marginal improvements seemed criminally wasteful. Yet here was America, at war, casually discarding working equipment. The food revelation, December 24th, Christmas Eve, arrived with unexpected abundance. The prisoners received a feast: roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, gravy, canned vegetables, fresh bread, butter, coffee, and, incredibly, pie made with real sugar and fruit. Bergmann stared at his tray, unable to process the quantity. His chicken portion alone weighed perhaps 300 grams. In Germany, his family's monthly meat ration had been 250 grams per person by 1944. Around him, prisoners ate in stunned silence, some openly weeping. Otto Kraus, the cynical Unteroffizier, put down his fork after 3 bites and covered his face with his hands. "My children," he whispered in German, "my children are eating turnips and acorn bread, if they're eating at all." But what shattered Bergmann's composure came afterward. When he helped with cleanup duty in the mess hall kitchen, the American cooks were scraping uneaten food into massive garbage bins: pounds of chicken, bowls of untouched potatoes, half-eaten pieces of pie. Waste. Casual, unthinking waste. "Hey Hans, take some of this back to your barracks if you want," one cook offered, gesturing at the surplus. "Made too much as usual. Can't save it." Health regulations. Health regulations prevented saving wholesome food. Bergmann carried a tray of leftover pie back to his barracks, where 26 men shared it in religious silence, savoring every crumb. Meanwhile, garbage bins overflowed with enough food to feed a German family for a week. The statistics he would later learn made the contrast even starker. German civilian meat ration, December 1944, 250 grams per person per month. American POW meat ration, December 1944, 450 grams per person per week. 8 times more German military bread ration, 1944, 700 grams daily, increasingly adulterated with sawdust, chestnuts, potato flour. American POW bread ration, 1944, unlimited fresh baked bread available at each meal. Estimated calories per day. German soldier, Eastern Front, 1944, 1,800 to 200, often lower. Actual calories per day. American POW in U.S. camps, 1944, 2,800, 3,200. Geneva Convention minimum, 2,500. The clothing surplus, January 3, 1945. After a particularly cold night, the camp received an emergency shipment of winter coats. Not thin jackets, but genuine winter coats, lined, insulated, designed for serious cold. Every prisoner received one, despite Louisiana's relatively mild winter. Within days, most prisoners wore them only in early morning, finding them too warm for the region's climate. Why did they send these? Bergmann asked Patterson, the Iowa guard who'd become a reluctant German tutor. Patterson shrugged. "Some quartermaster up in Washington figured y'all might need 'em. Better to have 'em and not need 'em than the other way around. Plus, Geneva Convention says we gotta treat POWs same as our own soldiers. Our boys get winter gear, you get winter gear. Same as their own soldiers." The phrase lodged in Bergmann's mind like shrapnel. In Germany, POWs were worked to death, starved, beaten. German newspapers celebrated this as justified treatment of enemies. Yet here were Americans, at war with Germany, issuing unnecessary winter coats to captured enemies because regulations and basic human decency required it. Bergmann learned that some American supply officers had even complained about the cost of maintaining POW camps to Geneva Convention standards. Not because they objected morally, but because the bureaucratic expense of properly feeding, clothing, and housing prisoners strained their paperwork systems. The abundance itself had become administratively burdensome. January 8, 1945. The psychological fractures were becoming visible now, spreading through the prisoner population like cracks in stressed metal. In the evenings, men gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed German, comparing observations. The conversations followed predictable patterns. They threw away 6 blankets today. 6. One had a small stain, just a stain, and they discarded it. The guards complain about their coffee being weak. Weak. I haven't tasted real coffee in 2 years. Patterson showed me photographs of his family's farm. His father owns 3 tractors. 3 for one farm. Our entire village shared 2 tractors before the war. Did you see the medical supplies? Bandages stacked to the ceiling. They use them once and throw them away. Once. The comparisons became obsessive, each man cataloging examples, building a mental inventory of American abundance that contradicted everything they'd been taught. But acceptance came slowly, fought at every step by pride, by loyalty, by the desperate need to believe the sacrifices had meant something. Otto Kraus remained the most resistant. "It's a trick," he insisted during one evening discussion. "They're showing us excess on purpose to break our spirits. America's cities are probably starving while they parade wealth in front of us." Propaganda. But even Kraus's certainty was eroding. Bergmann had watched him during the Christmas meal, seen the tears, witnessed the moment when propaganda collided with undeniable reality. A man could lie with words, but not with tears over food his children lacked while his enemies' enemies ate surplus. One prisoner, a former schoolteacher named Friedrich Weber, began documenting everything in a hidden journal, a dangerous violation of camp rules, but a compulsion he couldn't resist. Weber wrote measurements, quantities, observations. His entries, later recovered and donated to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, revealed the psychological devastation. January 10, 1945. Today helped inventory medical supplies, counted 2,400 sulfa drug packages in one cabinet alone. At home, one package would treat 3 families. Here, they give them freely for minor cuts. How can this be? We were told America was on the verge of collapse. January 15, 1945, witnessed American sergeant repair broken window, used entire tube of putty for one window, threw away remaining putty because tube was opened, said it would dry out anyway. In Germany, we scraped out tubes for weeks to use every trace. I feel I am going mad. Everything I knew is wrong. January 22, 1945. Spoke with Patterson about American farms. His family farm, 200 hectares, fully mechanized, produces surplus sold to government. My village's collective farms, 150 hectares total, worked by women and old men, produces barely enough to prevent starvation. He described farming as hard work, but decent living. I described German farming as survival. We were using the same word, farming, for entirely different realities. The breaking point arrived differently for each man, but it came. For Bergmann, the moment crystallized on a frigid February morning during a work detail outside the main camp. February 3, 1945. A particularly cold snap had hit Louisiana. Temperatures plunged to 7 degrees Celsius overnight. Unusual enough that American guards joked nervously about the unprecedented weather, Bergmann's work crew was assigned to help repair a fence line along the camp's northern perimeter, required to venture outside the compound under guard supervision. The work was simple enough, replacing wooden posts damaged by the cold, stretching new wire. But what caught Bergmann's attention was the scrap pile where damaged materials were tossed. Dozens of fence posts, most barely damaged. Spools of wire with perhaps 10 meters left, too short to be useful for fence repair, but perfectly good wire nonetheless. Work gloves with minor tears. A toolbox with a broken latch. All this goes to salvage. Bergmann asked Kowalski, who was supervising. Yep, gets picked up weekly. They'll melt down the wire, chip the wood for pulp, whatever. Easier than storing half-used stuff. Easier. More efficient to destroy and recreate than to conserve. The logic made sense from a position of overwhelming abundance, but Bergmann's German mind reeled at the wastefulness. Any of these damaged materials would be treasured in Germany, carefully stored against future need. The temperature continued dropping as they worked. By mid-morning, it had reached 9 degrees, genuinely cold now, even for men who'd endured worse. The American guards passed around a thermos of hot coffee, offering some to the prisoners. Bergmann accepted gratefully, wrapping his cold hands around the metal cup, feeling warmth seep into his fingers. And then he noticed what he was wearing, his thin American blanket, wrapped around his shoulders like a shawl over his winter coat. Several other prisoners had done the same, instinctively grabbing their blankets that morning for extra warmth. The blankets, those ridiculously thin, contemptibly lightweight blankets they'd mocked 11 weeks ago, were keeping them comfortable in weather that would have been dangerous with German equipment. The blanket's warmth was gentle but persistent, trapping body heat without the oppressive weight of wool. He could move freely, work effectively, remain warm without the restrictive bulk of traditional blankets. The synthetic wool blend, whose composition he still didn't understand, somehow achieved what German wool blankets had never managed: efficient warmth through advanced material science rather than primitive mass. In that moment, standing in an American scrapyard, drinking American coffee, wrapped in an American blanket whose engineering exceeded anything Germany had produced, Bergmann felt something crack inside. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet internal collapse, like a dam developing a fatal fissure. They're better, not just richer, better. The thought was blasphemous, unthinkable, devastating, but undeniable. The blanket proved it, the food proved it, the tools proved it, the casual waste proved it, the clean barracks, the functioning plumbing, the medical care, the systematic organization, the sheer, thoughtless abundance of everything. It all proved it. Germany hadn't been fighting a war against a weak enemy. Germany had been fighting a war against an industrial colossus, so powerful that it could afford to outfit its prisoners better than Germany equipped its own soldiers. The decadent Americans possessed such surplus that waste was cheaper than conservation. The mongrel race had built an economic machine so vast that its excess exceeded Germany's full production. Bergmann looked at the scrap pile again, seeing it with new eyes. This wasn't waste in the German sense, desperate disposal of unusable junk. This was the inevitable byproduct of an economy so productive that marginal resources weren't worth conserving. America's trash exceeded Germany's treasure. "Hans, you okay?" Kowalski was watching him with mild concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Just cold." Bergmann lied, pulling the blanket tighter, but he wasn't cold. The blanket kept him warm, terrifyingly warm, warm enough to make him wonder what other lies he'd believed. That evening, back in the barracks, Otto Kraus sat on his bunk, holding his blanket with an expression of quiet despair. The resistance had gone out of him. "My son," he said softly to no one in particular, "my son will ask me what the war was for. What do I tell him? That we fought the strongest nation on earth because we believed propaganda that they were weak, that we starved while they had surplus, that we died for lies?" No one answered. Around the barracks, men sat in contemplative silence, each processing his own demolition of certainty. Some would resist longer, months longer, some never fully accepting. But for most, including Bergmann, the transformation was complete. The thin American blanket, that first object of scorn and mockery, had become the symbol of their enlightenment. It wasn't just about blankets, never had been. It was about what blankets revealed, that Germany had sent them to die, fighting an enemy so powerful that even its mercy exceeded German strength, that the Führer had lied, that the 1,000-year Reich had been built on fantasy economics and superior propaganda. That master race ideology crumbled when confronted with American productivity, that they'd sacrificed everything for a doomed cause led by madmen. Friedrich Weber, the schoolteacher, wrote in his hidden journal that night, February 3, 1945, "Today I understood. We were not defeated by American soldiers. We were defeated by American factories, by the economy that produces blankets so efficient we mocked them out of ignorance, by the wealth so great they can waste more than we produce." How does a nation recover from such a revelation? How do I go home and explain that everything we believed was a lie, that we killed and died for nothing? The blanket keeps me warm while these thoughts freeze my soul. April 12, 1945. News reached Camp Ruston that President Roosevelt had died. The American guards seemed genuinely shaken, some openly sad, others grimly quiet. The German prisoners observed this with another kind of shock. the enemy grieving their leader with spontaneous, unforced emotion, not the carefully choreographed mourning demanded in Germany, but real human sadness. By now, Bergmann and many others had become something strange, not quite American, certainly no longer believing Germans, but men caught between worlds. They worked their jobs efficiently, learned more English, observed everything. The camp had become less a prison and more an inadvertent educational institution, teaching them about the nation they'd been sent to help destroy. The blankets remained constants, used nightly, washed weekly, never replaced unless genuinely damaged. Bergmann had grown accustomed to his to the point where he couldn't imagine sleeping without it. The psychological transformation that began with mockery had completed itself. The blanket was no longer an enemy artifact, but simply a good blanket. Perhaps the best blanket he'd ever owned. In late April, Germany began its final collapse. News filtered into camp. Hitler dead. Berlin fallen. Surrender imminent. The prisoners received this information with complex emotions, not quite grief, not quite relief, something more like exhausted acceptance. The war they'd fought, the cause they'd served, was ending in ash and ruin. Bergmann lay under his American blanket the night Germany officially surrendered, thinking about everything it represented. If Germany had possessed the industrial capacity to produce such blankets, to produce anything with such efficiency, such abundance, the war might have ended differently. But Germany hadn't possessed that capacity, had never possessed it, had been telling itself comforting lies about enemy weakness, while that enemy outproduced them in every category by ratios of 5 to 1. 10 to 1, sometimes 20 to 1. The blanket kept him warm through that night of reckoning, as it had kept him warm through the winter of his education. June 1945. Repatriation began. The prisoners were being sent home in groups, processed through camps in Europe before final release. Bergmann's group departed Camp Ruston on a warm June morning, each man allowed to take one personal item from American issue. Most took their blankets. The journey back to Germany took 3 weeks, train to the East Coast, ship to Le Havre, then trucks into what remained of the Reich. With each mile, the destruction became more evident. Cities reduced to rubble, bridges collapsed, factories bombed into twisted metal sculptures, refugees crowding roads, children begging for food, the apocalyptic landscape of total defeat. When Bergmann finally reached what remained of Düsseldorf in July 1945, he found his family's apartment building partially destroyed, his mother and sister living in the basement with 6 other families. They'd survived on rations that averaged 800 calories per day, starvation level. His sister, 17, weighed perhaps 40 kilograms, her face gaunt and hollow. His mother wept when she saw him, not just from joy, but from shock at his relative health. "You look..." She couldn't finish the sentence. What she meant, "You look well fed, you look healthy, you look like you haven't been starving." Because he hadn't. He'd been eating 3,000 calories daily in American captivity, while his family slowly starved in the ruins of the Reich. The guilt was crushing, but so was the truth. His American captors had treated him better than his own government had treated his family. He showed them the blanket, still clean, still functional, still efficiently warm despite months of use. His mother touched it reverently, feeling the quality. "American?" she asked. "Yes." They gave one to every prisoner. 2, actually. I left the other behind for someone who needed it more. His sister wrapped herself in it, despite the summer heat, craving any comfort. "It's so soft," she whispered. "So light." Bergmann didn't tell them about the abundance, not immediately. How could he explain that the enemy had thrown away food, discarded perfect blankets, complained about surplus while Germany starved? The contrast was too vast, too devastating. It would come out gradually over months of conversations as he and other returning prisoners shared their experiences and Germany began confronting the magnitude of its delusion. The blanket remained in his family for years. His mother used it through the brutal winter of 1946-47, when famine killed thousands more Germans. His sister used it when she married in 1948, one of her few possessions. It represented something they couldn't quite articulate, proof that the enemy had been better than they'd imagined, that German suffering had been unnecessary, that the war had been lost before it truly began because the material gap was insurmountable. October 1978. Hans Bergmann, now 60 years old, sat in his comfortable Dusseldorf apartment being interviewed by a young graduate student from the University of Cologne researching German POW experiences. The blanket, now threadbare, patched in several places but still functional, lay folded on his lap. "Herr Bergmann, you've kept this blanket for 33 years. Why?" Bergmann ran his fingers over the worn fabric, thinking carefully about his answer. "Because it taught me the most important lesson of my life," he finally said. "Not about blankets, but about truth." The student waited, recorder running. "We were told America was weak, decadent, inferior. We believed it because we wanted to believe it, because our government told us to believe it, because believing otherwise meant accepting that we'd hitched our fate to madmen. This blanket, this simple, thin blanket we mocked when we first saw it, proved us wrong more effectively than any propaganda could have." He held it up, showing the student how even now, decades later, and worn nearly through, it retained its structure, its efficiency. It was lighter than our blankets, but warmer, more advanced, better engineered. We laughed at it out of ignorance and arrogance. That laughter was the sound of men who'd been lied to for so long we couldn't recognize truth when wrapped in it. The student nodded, making notes. "So the blanket became symbolic?" "Everything in that camp was symbolic," Bergmann replied. "The food we couldn't finish while our families starved. The tools they treated carelessly because replacement was trivial. The casual waste that exceeded our total production. But the blanket was personal. It touched my skin every night. It kept me alive through cold weather. It was the first thing that made me question what I'd been taught." He paused, then continued with quiet intensity. "Young man, you're too young to remember the war, too young to understand what it felt like to discover your entire worldview was constructed on lies. That's what this blanket represents, the moment when reality became unavoidable. Germany didn't lose the war in 1945. Germany lost the war in 1939, maybe earlier, when we challenged an enemy so far beyond our capacity that even their POW blankets exceeded our military issue. Did other prisoners feel the same? Eventually, most of us did. Some resisted longer, some never accepted it. But for most, the evidence accumulated until denial became impossible. We were fed better, clothed better, treated better than our own government treated German civilians. How do you maintain hatred for an enemy who shows you more humanity than your own leaders? The interview continued for 2 more hours. Bergmann shared statistics he'd later researched, the production comparisons, the economic disparities, the technological gaps. But he always returned to the blanket, that tangible proof that American superiority wasn't propaganda, but engineering, not fantasy, but measured reality. "I tell my grandchildren," he concluded, "that the war taught me to question authority, to demand evidence, to recognize that just because everyone believes something doesn't make it true. This blanket, laughable, retries to continue thin American, was my teacher. It kept me warm while my illusions froze and died. I wouldn't trade that education for anything, though it cost me everything I'd believed." After the student left, Bergmann sat alone with the blanket, remembering. 33 years had passed, but he could still recall the weight of it in his hands that first December night, the contempt he'd felt, the certainty that German quality exceeded American cheapness. The memory embarrassed him now, not just the wrongness of it, but the arrogance, the willful blindness, the comfort of prejudice. He'd built a good life after the war, returned to his trade as a mechanic, eventually opened his own shop, raised 2 children who'd never known Nazi Germany. He'd prospered in the new Federal Republic, voted in free elections, traveled to America twice on business. His son had married an American woman he'd met while studying engineering in Michigan. His grandson was half American, spoke English fluently, carried a U.S. passport along with his German one. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd fought to destroy America, and now his family tree was grafted onto it. But that felt right somehow. The blanket had been trying to tell him something in 1944, that nations weren't enemies by nature, that ordinary decency transcended propaganda, that shared humanity mattered more than nationalist mythology. Grandfather? His grandson Michael had let himself in with a key. "I didn't know you were home." Bergmann smiled. "Just finishing an interview. University student researching POW experiences." Michael noticed the blanket. He'd heard its story many times growing up, but he approached it with renewed interest now. studying history himself at university. You still have it, after all these years. After all these years, Bergmann confirmed. Would you like it? When I'm gone, I mean. Your grandmother wants the good china, your sister wants the photographs, but this might mean something to you. Michael touched the worn fabric gently. Because I'm half American? Because you're proof that the future is wiser than the past. That blanket kept me alive through winter. It also kept me sane through the spring when I learned what Germany had become, what we'd done, what we'd believed. I want you to remember that symbols matter, that ordinary objects can teach extraordinary lessons if we're willing to learn. Later, after Michael left, Bergmann unfolded the blanket and wrapped it around his shoulders despite the October warmth. It still worked, still trapped heat efficiently, still demonstrated American material science from 1944, 78 years old now. The blanket, patched and worn and faded, but functional. Like him, really. He thought about Otto Kraus, dead now for 10 years, who'd gone to his grave unable to fully accept what they'd learned. About Friedrich Weber, the schoolteacher, who'd published his prison journal in 1952 and become a vocal pacifist, lecturing on the dangers of nationalism until his death in 1971. About Patterson, the Iowa farm boy, whom Bergmann had tracked down in 1965 during his first American business trip. They'd shared a meal, two old veterans comparing memories, laughing about the language lessons, carefully avoiding discussion of deeper things. Patterson had seemed surprised that Bergmann remembered him at all, didn't understand that the guards had been teachers too, demonstrating through casual behavior what propaganda never revealed, that Americans were just people, neither demons nor angels, just people living in a nation wealthy enough to afford generosity. March 1990. Bergmann died peacefully in his sleep at age 72. The blanket folded at the foot of his bed, where it had rested for 45 years. His will specified that it should go to Michael, along with a letter explaining its significance. The letter, later donated to the Deutsches Historisches Museum in Berlin, read in part, "My dear Michael, this blanket arrived in my life at a moment when I needed truth more than warmth, though it provided both. We mocked it because accepting its quality meant accepting our ignorance. We laughed at American efficiency because the alternative, admitting we'd been lied to, that we'd fought for lies, that everything we'd sacrificed meant nothing, was too devastating to contemplate. But truth insists. This blanket insisted night after night, keeping me warm with its impossible efficiency. And gradually, the insistence wore down my resistance. I learned to accept that being wrong wasn't weakness, but the first step toward wisdom. You live in a united Germany now, free from the madness that consumed my generation. You carry 2 passports, claim 2 heritages. This seems natural to you because you weren't taught to hate. The blanket taught me what you've always known, that human ingenuity doesn't belong to races or nations, that quality is quality regardless of origin, that the object that serves you well deserves respect no matter whose factory produced it. Keep this blanket, not as a relic, but as a reminder that certainty can blind, that propaganda feels like truth until reality intrudes, that questioning received wisdom is patriotic duty. When someone tells you that your nation is superior, that your enemies are inferior, that your cause justifies any sacrifice, think of this thin American blanket that proved all such claims hollow. I was wrong about so much, but I was right to keep learning, right to accept correction, right to let this simple object teach me complicated truths. That's my legacy to you. Not pride in having fought, but pride in having learned. With love, your grandfather Michael framed the letter and displayed it with the blanket in his home in Frankfurt. His children, Bergmann's great-grandchildren born in 1988 and 1990, would grow up hearing the story. For them, it would be ancient history, barely comprehensible that their great-grandfather had once fought Americans, once believed in Nazi ideology, once been so certain he was right. But they understood the blanket's lesson simplified into a maxim their father repeated often: question everything, test beliefs against evidence, change your mind when facts demand it. Pride in being right isn't worth as much as wisdom in being wrong. Historical assessment. The psychological transformation experienced by Bergmann and hundreds of thousands of German POWs in American camps has been extensively documented by historians. Dr. Arnold Kramer, in his definitive 1979 study Nazi Prisoners of War in America, wrote, "The shock of American abundance affected German prisoners more profoundly than any propaganda campaign could have achieved. Men who'd been taught that America was a failing plutocracy discovered an industrial machine so vast that POW camps were better supplied than German military units. This cognitive dissonance shattered ideological conditioning more effectively than any re-education program. The statistics that prisoners like Bergmann gradually learned told a story of material disparity so vast it seemed almost impossible. Total U.S. textile production, 1944, 15.2 billion square meters. Total German textile production, 1944, 2.1 billion square meters. American advantage, 7.2 times greater U.S. Military blanket specifications, 1944, required to maintain warmth at 18 degrees C, weigh less than 1.5 cot, resist moisture. German military blanket specifications, 1944, no formal specifications, whatever could be produced from available materials. Number of German POWs who immigrated to United States after the war, approximately 25,000 number who reported positive treatment in American camps. Over 90% in post-war surveys, number who credited POW experience with changing political views. Approximately 60%. A 1985 study by the German War Graves Commission found that German POWs held in the United States had survival rates of 99.3%, actually higher than American soldiers in combat, and dramatically higher than German soldiers on the Eastern Front, 75% survival rate, or German civilians in bombed cities, varying widely by location. The Geneva Convention compliance rate of American POW camps, according to International Red Cross reports from 1943-1946, exceeded 95%. Not perfect, but remarkable given the scale of the operation and the ongoing war. By contrast, German compliance with Geneva Convention standards for Soviet POWs was estimated at less than 10%, with Soviet POW mortality in German camps reaching 57%. Dr. Judith Gansberg, in her 1977 book, Stalag USA, documented the phenomenon of blankets specifically. The standard U.S. Army blanket issued to POWs, the M1941 wool synthetic blend, represented American material science advantages that prisoners immediately recognized. Weighing 680 grams versus 900 grams for German equivalents, yet providing 6% better thermal retention, these blankets were physical proof of industrial sophistication that contradicted Nazi propaganda about American inferiority. She quoted multiple prisoner accounts describing the psychological impact. "We laughed at the blankets until we didn't," wrote former Lieutenant Heinrich Schaefer in his 1961 memoir. "Then we couldn't stop thinking about what they represented." Not just better engineering, but a nation that could afford to make enemy prisoners comfortable. That casual generosity, not kindness exactly, just policy, devastated our certainties more than hatred would have. The blankets became iconic enough that several museums now display them as examples of psychological warfare through abundance. The Imperial War Museum in London features one in their Home Fronts exhibition with the caption, "The Thin American Blanket That Shattered Axis Illusions, Proof that Propaganda Meets Reality in Unexpected Places." The blanket's final lesson, the story of Hans Bergmann and his American blanket, multiplied across 380,000 German POWs held in U.S. camps, reveals a profound historical truth about World War II that military histories often miss. Germany didn't lose the war primarily through battlefield defeats. Germany lost the war in factories, on assembly lines, in the organizational systems that allowed America to produce not just enough for victory, but enough for surplus, enough for waste, enough to outfit enemies with better equipment than the Reich could provide its own soldiers. The thin blanket became more than textile. It was evidence, measurement, proof. It was the physical manifestation of disparities that propaganda couldn't explain away. Production ratios of 7-1, 10-1, sometimes 20-1 in America's favor across virtually every category. It was the symbol of an industrial base so vast that its excess exceeded German totality. For Bergmann, lying under that blanket in December 1944, the warmth seeping through its impossibly thin fibers carried a message he couldn't ignore. You were lied to. The enemy you were sent to destroy was stronger than your leaders in every measurable way. The master race was beaten by superior organization, superior technology, superior productivity. Not by genetic superiority or ideological purity, but by free people working together to produce abundance. That lesson, learned gradually, resisted fiercely, finally accepted reluctantly, shaped post-war Germany more than historians typically acknowledge. The hundreds of thousands of returning POWs brought back not just stories, but transformed worldviews. They'd seen American democracy function, American abundance exist, American casual tolerance of diversity work. They became implicit advocates for the Western model that would rebuild West Germany, often without consciously intending to. The blanket Hans Bergmann kept for 45 years, now displayed in his grandson's Frankfurt home, represents all of this. The power of material reality to overwhelm propaganda, the educational value of cognitive dissonance, the transformative potential of unexpected kindness, and the simple truth that objects tell stories propaganda cannot silence. In the end, it wasn't just a blanket. It was a teacher, a revelation, a demolition of certainty, and a foundation for wisdom. It kept one German soldier warm through the winter of 1944-45. More importantly, it kept him honest through the remaining decades of his life, a physical reminder that certainty without evidence is just another word for delusion. Question everything, Bergmann had written to his grandson. Let reality be your teacher, not ideology. And remember, the enemy who treated me with casual decency taught me more about humanity than the Reich that demanded my loyalty. The thin American blanket, mocked, then accepted, then treasured, had accomplished what no weapon could. It had changed a mind, transformed a worldview, and taught a lesson that lasted longer than the 1,000-year Reich by a factor of approximately 1,000 years. That was its final warmth, not the heat it trapped, but the light it revealed.